My name is Janae Nugent. I'm a teaching fellow in the Teaching Center, and we were here to talk about classroom space and the use of different teaching spaces on campus today. I'm joined with Craig Finley from the Department of Education, Kimberly Mayer from the Department of Sociology, and Jochen Buxnick from the Department of Kinesiology. So I think that the use of classroom space on campus has got a lot of attention in the last couple of years with the creation of the LEE project, or the Learning Environment Evaluation Project. It's made faculty start thinking a lot about different teaching spaces, and it's really begun to shape sort of the conversations that we've been having on campus. And so I'm curious, when you got the phone call to participate in this particular conversation, or I guess it was an email, to participate in this conversation, I was wondering, is there anything that sort of jumped to your mind immediately about an issue or an experience that you have sort of identified and feel that it's something that's important to talk about? And maybe we could start with Craig.
Sure. I guess I'll give you a little bit of my own personal context. I'm a seconded teacher in the Faculty of Education, so I come from 20 years of teaching in a high school environment. And so what resonated with me immediately with the topic of conversation was something really that's been an ongoing discussion in high schools for quite some time, which is reimagining the teaching and learning space that is a traditional school. And I come from a brand new high school which was built in a very traditional form. It's a very utilitarian building. It's one gigantic hallway with 2 floors of rectangular box classrooms. And it's interesting now that I think if you would have asked people 5 years ago when it was being built, how should we build it? And they were answering now, it would be a very different space. So they're trying to reimagine what teaching and learning spaces can be like in a high school environment. So cafeterias, libraries, common spaces, to allow for a much more collaborative teaching and learning environment. And now that I'm here at the University of Lethbridge, I think I see a lot more of those environments, especially in the Faculty of Education, where you have large open rooms with movable desks, and oftentimes instructors are moving their classes into groups, and then the other thing that immediately popped to mind was a couple of sessions that I've been able to do inside the Scale Up room, which is a really exciting teaching and learning environment. And I know for me, in both of those sessions, my mind was racing about what my future classrooms might look like, and really excited about a classroom that I guess maybe more from the high school perspective, but becomes much more student-centered as opposed to teacher-centered. And when you're in those rooms, it's almost uncomfortable about where the instructor or the person that's leading the seminar stands, because it's not meant to be teacher-centered. It's meant to be student-centered. And so that's just a sampling of the things that were running through my mind when you invited me to be a part of this.
Yeah, I'm teaching for this semester one of my classes in the Scale Up classroom, and so the Scale Up classroom is Anderson Hall 177, and it is an interesting classroom because it doesn't have a front of the room. Mm-hmm. It has desks around the room, and every student can sort of plug into a screen. They have whiteboards at every space, at every table, and so students can really the idea is on learning collaboratively as a group, and it is a fascinating sort of place to teach from. So yeah, I find myself wandering around the classroom, not quite sure where I should stand, but I got very comfortable about it in a very short amount of time, because it's just so exciting to see the students really become active and engaged learners all the time. There's no room for them to just sit back and not participate and not be part of the learning process, because they're always there in that group, always having to contribute in a small group environment. And it is really exciting because you can sort of make that transition between the two very, very quickly. Kimberly, you're going to be teaching in that classroom.
I am in the fall. Yeah, I'm very excited about it. I also really like that it has multiple screens, decentered screens, which you can put multiple sources up on, which I think makes a huge difference.
Right.
And one of the things that I'm interested in about classroom spaces is the way in which they do kind of contain a logic or a rationality in their design, which does already make some sort of assumptions about what knowledge is and how knowledge flows. And with traditional classrooms, there is that assumption that there's this expert at the front of the room that possesses knowledge that is some kind of stable object, right? And of course, we don't want to have rooms operating in that way. So we have to kind of use practices that can disrupt that. But here, of course, there's been all of these different rooms that are already in the design disrupting that vision of what knowledge is or how it moves.
Yeah, the instructor at the front of the classroom, not moving and sort of lecturing is a very, a very specific model of learning, but we don't all do that. Jochen, you don't.
Yeah. Well, I teach in the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education, and I would say I'm a physical education person. And not moving and myself are oxymoron. And the ideal classroom for me, actually, I would say, is the gym, or any kind of very far open spaces, because everything that I teach about has to do with movement. And so consequently, the ability to move around, either me moving between the students, among the students, or the students having to move, those are essential components, because a lot of it has to do with observation, with the ability to detect things that you would like to observe and stuff like that. And so the open space really is an essential part for me.
Yeah, you need to get in to do your sort of not experiments, but your demonstrations.
Well, a lot of the things have to do with really demonstrations, because while you try to create pictures, while you try to explain something, a movement or a posture or whatever it might be, more often than not, students relate to it much, much better if they can see it. And of course, from a perspective of students having to investigate or having to determine where there is a mistake or where there is a shortcoming here or there, they need to be able to observe something, and they need to be able to observe it on the spot, because from a coaching perspective or from a teacher's, physical education teacher's perspective, it is you have to determine right there on the spot and immediately provide a correction for it. And I think those two aspects combined mean it has to be very kind of active, the environment. And sitting at desks, particularly when the desks are bolted down, long rows, and it's really restrictive.
Yeah, it makes me go back to a point that Kimberly was talking about as well, is about knowledge in the classroom and where does knowledge come from. And it's not necessarily from, somebody standing at the front of the classroom telling them, but rather it's often that interactive learning where they're, having to do and they're having to be corrected, and that knowledge is coming from their peers and from that action and that activity as well. So I think that turns a lot of sort of old assumptions about universities and how the classrooms are set up, with those fixed rows and those fixed furniture at the front of the room. So have you had that experience in your classrooms at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think even sometimes when I've had classes in some of the older rooms where you do have those fixed seats that are facing forward, and there are a lot of students, so you don't have a lot of flexibility. But there are sometimes you just have to kind of go with the flow and try to actually use spaces that aren't actually considered. Because you had mentioned that too, right? There are spaces that are only meant for they're not meant for the teaching aspect or the learning aspect, right? So making use of some of the spaces that are not considered usable space or are only considered transient space in the room, and there actually are real opportunities for that, and ways in which you can have different people doing different things in a room, and students might think you're a bit strange when you ask them to do certain things or go into certain spaces. But once that breaks down, it's much more active, and I think the main thing is to kind of present knowledge as a public good that is very, it's unsettled, and so that invites students right from the start to sort of see concepts and texts as things that ought to be challenged, that their authority is not set in stone, and that they have something to contribute to this process. They're contributors rather than receivers.
I believe that is a this aspect that it is a public domain, that the learning is a public domain, so to speak, is a very difficult and challenging one for many, many people. That certainly in the past, I think, has been probably sort of challenged predominantly by either people in music or demonstrating arts and kinesiology or physical education, because everything that we do is public. You don't, so to speak, just act for yourself when you run 100 meter or when you jump, but it is visible by everyone. Whereas if I solve a math problem, well, in essence, it is just visible for myself and then possibly for the teacher who is reviewing it. And that makes this concept, it is a difficult one to get students over that hurdle, that the sharing of information and then as a result thereof accepting feedback from other people really actually is enhancing your own personal performances.
Something that Joachim mentioned, I think makes me think of more conversations that we're having, again, primarily at the classroom, high school classroom level, but I think also here in the Faculty of Education is that idea of learning spaces being active spaces. And I think that is certainly true in my experience, again, even within the Faculty of Education, where you might come in and there are groups of desks, but oftentimes students are moving and they need spaces to go and collaborate with other groups, or if there's time for conversations to be had, invite them even to leave the classroom and go for a stroll, go for a walk. And so that idea of learning not being sitting in a desk for an hour seminar or sometimes a 3-hour seminar, but having the freedom to be able to get up and move around, I think is really, really important as well.
Yeah, Joachim has a story that I think is quite funny about trying to change his desk configuration in one of his classes.
Yeah, I'm currently teaching in the library building. I believe it's L1050, and it's one of these wonderful new classrooms, and I set some tables in an angle. As a student, just prior to the students coming in, and I was watching as the students came in and straightened them out, because this is how we sit. And it is all about, of course, the predictability and on how people conform, in this case, so to speak, unknowingly, really in an implicit way to norms that they have adopted long, long time ago, and they are still so hard. Even sort of with current knowledge, like current health knowledge, I would say, let's get rid of the tables altogether. Let's have stand-up tables. Partially because, of course, sitting for too many hours a day is very counterproductive to physical health. And now that would really make this concept of a moving space phenomenal. I know there are disadvantages with that. Where do you put your, for example, laptop, or where do you take notes? But, I'm sure there could be stand-up tables for that.
I think learning environments in general just need to be much more flexible. I think, your comments speak to that for sure.
Yeah, could any of you speak to like specific examples where you can see that you've changed that sort of traditional experience, and how the students really are challenged in their learning and sort of pulled into be active and engaged learners rather than just sitting back and hiding behind that desk and hiding as a face amongst the crowd?
Quite regularly, and of course it will always depend on the type of class that you teach or that I teach. And so quite often I sit among the students. I go to the very back. And there is a number of different reasons for that. The one is it certainly sort of cuts down on the use of the inappropriate use of the laptop or the cell phone. Because obviously they don't want to get caught, so to speak, watching a movie while we're talking about something, discussing something. But it also changes the focus point, the focal point within the classroom if I'm all of a sudden sitting in the back. Because now people already have to turn around and shift. And where in the world is that guy? And I think that is an important part. Is it a dramatic change? No, not necessarily, but it is a change. And that, I think, is the first part of it.
I think within the Faculty of Education, like in the room that we're in here, all of the rooms that I've had a chance to teach in are all big spaces, first of all, but they all have tables, and you can configure them in whatever way you choose. And for all of my classes, I always configure in groups. So students are forced to sit facing each other. And I think that pulls attention away from the instructor, me at the front, to themselves. And I think that almost demands that I create a learning environment which calls on lots of discourse and dialogue, which is, I think, that collaborative learning is the most powerful learning. And I have an interesting contrast. I'm also teaching an Ed 2500 course, which is a very beginning sort of wanting to explore the profession course. So a lot of students are kind of reconnecting with the education system that they've left not too long ago. And it's funny, I'm teaching downstairs in Turcotte Hall, which is a more traditional classroom with desks. And every time the students come in, how do they arrange? They arrange in rows in a very traditional way. So it's an interesting contrast for me. I think it reinforces what both of your comments were speaking to, that we have these norms in education that have been well established, and it's hard to break from them. But I think it's starting to happen, so that's exciting.
Well, I've used, the class I'm going to teach in Scale Up next fall, I ran as sort of a pilot last fall, and that was sort of an experiment in participatory classrooms. So it was like an inverted model where, there's minimal lecturing, and a lot of the work gets done with particularly the scholarly text outside of class time. And so primarily what the students did was participate in a collaborative project over a 3-month period. So that's probably the most active thing that I've done, or the furthest I've gone in terms of trying to upset that kind of more traditional relationship of, that kind of privileges that one-directional flow, or ask students to reflect, back some kind of content. But this was all about, it was very much about form and very much about what they could do with these materials, and in fact challenge them and make their own kind of texts, their own even counter text, as Shiro would say. But so it was a very good experience. So I'm really excited about doing it in Scale Up, because that the space will match what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We've spoken a little bit about that class, and it's a really interesting class. And I'm wondering, could you, were you really happy at the end for the goals that you set out at the beginning of the class, for, the types of skills that you wanted them to develop in terms, in contrast, was there any difference in contrast to, say, a class where you've set out the goals for the class, where it's a more traditional model of sitting,
Yeah, I could have delivered the same content, in a more traditional form, but then they would not have. It was kind of one of these things. It was digital culture, so and I decided to narrow that down, which still didn't narrow it, to participatory culture, but then used a participatory classroom. So in a sense, they actually were experiencing, in the very mode of their, work, they were actually experiencing, the kinds of things that, happen in, participatory, Web 2.0, right? Fandoms and informal mentorship, and producing, a sort of social connection where the valuing of each other's contributions, that's sort of part of that culture. And so they actually had to perform that in a way, right? To do their, and that was part of what they were, they were actually, evaluated primarily on their ability to sort of approximate that kind of, relationship with each other. And I don't know whether reading that out of a book or hearing someone lecture about that actually allows you to think about those things in the same way, as actually having your work be, not just individualized, as having shared authorship and all those things, and actually having to kind of come to terms with what does that mean, and what would I have accomplished had I done this alone? What would have been different? What would I have lost, and what would I have gained? And those are things that we kind of talked about at the end. And I think that they, for the most part, felt that they gained something by producing that work together.
No, I was just going to ask, actually, you picked up on a little bit in terms of their feedback on that structure, which sounds very different, of course, than what they were used to. What was their feedback? Did they enjoy that? Or?
They did really enjoy that. They did really enjoy that. I did really get really great feedback. I mean, I thought it was, I do think that there were some things that, with a couple of them, I don't know, I suppose there were a couple of people in the room that maybe didn't, experience it, in the ways I'd hoped, I guess. I mean, they all enjoyed it, but obviously there's always some people in the class that maybe don't, I guess what you hope they'll get from in terms of the understanding. But I would say that I don't know whether they, I don't know that they understood the concepts in any more or less than they would have, but I think they at least they all had experience with them, so they could definitely have a stronger critical response to what we were talking about than they would have if we had just read about these things or talked about these things.
I think it really depends a lot on the learning objectives and what it is that you really try to get across. There is, let's say, just strict content, and that is the one that you could take out of the book. But then there's also a lot of items that I would consider as being, from my point of view, and this is really perhaps just a personal point of view, that I would consider as being important when they, or after they have left here the university, and they embark on a professional life and become, let's say, a collaborator in a team approach, and they are no longer the single source that is responsible for whatever it is that they have on their plate. And so, for instance, I do a fair amount of team work, so to speak, and this is actually for many students something that, or I feel, that they don't like. Because now all of a sudden I'm not personally evaluated and responsible for the outcome, and it is quite often difficult sort of to get the point across. But in the future, when you leave here, this is pretty much the only source in how you will work. You will work as one of many. You will not be the one that is the sole initiator, executor, and you are part of a bigger set. And so having this first exposure, I would say, or one of the initial exposure to this working as a member of a team, it might not be the best experience, but I think it is a necessary one. And just from that perspective, just like public speaking, and I do explain to the student, I do consider it an important part. Communication is one in the written way, and then there's an oral communication, and the two are not necessarily the same. And we do have strengths and weaknesses, and if you're a member of a team, you share, and you look for who is the best contributor on this or that side. So,
yeah, I think that gets to a lot of what I hold close to me when I think about my pedagogy and my teaching philosophy, and that is, what do I ultimately want my students to take away from this? I teach history, so sure, content is absolutely important, context is important, but ultimately what I want them to walk away with are those skills that are going to make them really not just good employees, but also engaged citizens, good members of their community. And so, sort of thinking and understanding the complexity of problems and historical events, and how, sort of understanding where other people are coming from and what that means, and understanding a problem and actually being able to offer effective solutions to that. And I think that, the space that we use in our teaching can allow us to sort of build on those skills a lot more or a lot less, depending on the classroom that you're given. And I would say that this has been my philosophy all along, and I would just go into a room and kind of make the room work for me as much as I possibly could. But with the newer projects, with the newer classrooms around campus, and sort of a broader understanding of what is learning space, right? And yours is online. Mm-hmm. It's not even just physical necessarily in the buildings. It really has made me challenge my own complacency in accepting, just a standard classroom, because I think that my ability to achieve my own pedagogical skills or my own pedagogical goals, I should say, have really been sharply shaped by the classroom and the learning environment. And what about, do you feel that with your own?
Absolutely, and again, when you say that, immediately I think of the scale-up room, because I think it's just being in that space, and I haven't had a chance to teach in that space, but just being in that space, and as we were alluding to earlier, not knowing where to stand, and it forces you to question your pedagogy and your practice about the transfer of learning, as you've referenced a couple of times. Is it just funneled through one person, or, well, no, in this environment, how do I do that? So you have to rethink how how your classroom is going to work. And I think that's the power of how you lay out a classroom. If you walk into a classroom that's very traditional, and there's a clear station at the front for somebody to stand in, and there are clear rows of desks or seats for students, I mean, that is certainly a big push towards a certain type of teaching practice. So I think, the physical layout of a room can have a dramatic impact on the way people envision the teaching and learning process, for sure.
I had a surprising gift, and I apologize that I don't actually know the room number, but this term, I find it every day, don't worry. I actually do show up to class, but I don't know the room number, but it's in W, and it's obviously one of LEAD projects.
565?
It could be. Okay. Yeah, that could be right. And it's got all the table, they're individual desks, and they have, their own little, the desk part. That's just, and the chairs are on casters, and it's just a room full of those, and it's amazing because you can do anything. But it's, I really feel like, it's going to take me a while to think of all the possibilities, right? And it kind of threw me, because that particular class, I've always dreamed of having, say, even a room like this one as it's normally set up. And, and I've always thought, oh, if I could have that for this class, that would be amazing. And so I was shocked when I walked in, and, I'm sure I'm not, I haven't, had enough time yet to absorb what all could be possible. But it is funny, because when I walk in, there is that kind of, not a row formation, but close to a row formation, but that's being disrupted now, and I just start wheeling. I've started sitting in one and just wheeling up to them, and then they'll just kind of go into a circle, and and it's good. It's a great room.
I have to say, these lines or the rows that you described are lines of demarcation. Very specific, very hard, and very difficult to break down. And in that regards, if it was at all possible for me, or for most of the areas that I teach, even if it was affecting research methods, going into the big gym, that would be the ideal space. Because then really everything is unpredictable. And I think there is a lot to be said about being predictable in the unpredictability. Because everything becomes, or is then a kind of a surprise. It's new, and if you want to be with it, you have to be in tune with it. Whereas if you know where you sit, you know exactly who is sitting to the left, to the right of you, you know where the power line is, and so on. Immediately these kind of habits of, for example, the cell phone comes out. The cell phone stands actually on the back of the laptop, so I can have two different screens at the same time. These are all the predictabilities, and if I can remove those ones, man, I have it made for myself. That's why in these let's not call it old-fashioned, but in some of these, let's call it more traditional classrooms, row seatings and so on, sometimes I have to jump onto the table to demonstrate something. And I know these are actually also the experiences that the students will recall. When I'm on top of the table and walk over top of people, because this is the only way for me to get there. The upscale classrooms, they do provide that flexibility. However, I do see also a problem with them. They have a phenomenal amount of technology kind of built in. And with the built-in technology come expectations. from side of the consumer, and that is the student in that regards. And sometimes for me it's difficult then to think, okay, I know it's doable, but I'm not that savvy. And so it would be wonderful if I could create an image here and an image there, and then, for example, cancel them out and have only a voice so that they only hear a sound. It would be wonderful, but you know what? I don't get to practice in these rooms. It's not like a surgical theater where I can actually practice to get myself ready for it. Because from my side, teaching in these new classrooms, it does require practice.
If I could just comment quickly on the technology part, because I appreciate greatly what you're saying. However, when I came out of the scale-up room in the first session that I went to, I immediately started imagining what my high school classroom might look like, and or a faculty of ed classroom, and I think you can achieve the same goals in a room by simply mimicking the arrangement that's in there, which is to create tables. So I could imagine removing all of the desks from my classroom and just having 6 tables with 6 chairs around them, and not even a computer screen or a laptop, but just a whiteboard for collaboration. And I think just that simple rearrangement, and with those very simple rudimentary tools, you could achieve a lot of the same outcomes that room forces people to reimagine again their teaching and their learning environment. And I think the technology is a perk for sure, and I think it expands what you can do. But I think it's actually the physical space and the way it's arranged that's much more powerful.
Yeah,
for me personally.
I couldn't agree more in that particular space. And I do use the technology here and there, but it's not the showpiece. It's not the centerpiece. And my students, I don't think that they do have expectations. At least nobody sort of said it. Although they do ooh and ah when I do use some of the technology. It's like the document camera. All of a sudden I said, oh, you're talking about this map, instead of describing it, put it under the doc camera, and then I was able to put it to everybody's tables, and they're like, oh, the technology in this room. And students do like it. There's no doubt about it. I completely agree. But there's been a number of days where I haven't used any of the technology. It's been, I've lectured. They've had my traditional PowerPoint that I've used for this class in other ways. But then what I love about it is that I can stop and say, okay, so I've just talked about judicial process in the witch hunts in early modern Europe. That's the class I'm teaching. And I've given you sort of the content and the context. Now I want you to talk amongst each other and tell me, how does that contribute to state centralization? How does that contribute to the witch hunts? And then I'll give a list of questions. Instead of me answering them in a lecture, which I would have done in a bigger classroom, they just immediately look at each other and they start the conversation. And when they're done, we go back and I give some more information, and then I ask another question. And they're just so tuned into each other and their groups and going back and forth that I no longer stand at the front of the room and give them a huge lecture, but rather those conversations are constantly going back and forth. And it's not just, throwing it out there to a group of 35 students and the usual 6 or 7 are comfortable answering in a big group, but rather they're in those smaller groups. They tend to sit, they're creatures of habit, they tend to sit with the same group all the time. I do shake that up here and there, but they do very much get comfortable with one another, and they love to challenge one another. They pick up on the conversations they had the last class and start, adding all of these themes and weaving them together. And it's that space, right? It's that configuration that allows them to really begin to engage and challenge one another and stand their own ground and pull out their own evidence and, create a strong argument. And so the technology, definitely I love it because there's lots of cool things I can do, but I don't rely on it. I totally agree that it's more the space.
It's not that I have to rely on the technology, but I think, and maybe that's what I needed to get across, is that if I have access to it and I would like to use it, then I need to have the practice time I can actually learn on how to use it and how to use it effectively. And sometimes I actually have found myself at the beginning of a term and things have changed. And how do we love this when at the beginning of the term, right, first day of class, and the setup somehow has changed. Because then you feel really, you're so ignorant, so uneducated about this stuff. And but that was just I think my comment about the technology.
Well, I mean, I understand. I mean, I definitely understand that it is true. Every room you go into, you kind of think, well, yeah, you don't know for sure what kind of interfaces you're going to be facing, and what I do think that one of the things that's nice about something like Scale Up is that, first of all, I do think that space lends itself to a quicker, kind of sense of comfortability, that's not a word, of comfort between everyone. And I think, while it's true, on a first day of class, if you can't deal with the technology and you ask the class if anybody is familiar with whatever it is you're dealing with, they will all look at you like they've never seen or heard of that before. But I think, I actually think that what's nice about something like Scale Up is that even if you're not using it, and I do think that it's important to suspend the technology sometimes, and and to refuse the discipline, which I think, or socialization that we often get from students, that they want, they do sometimes seem to really want slides or something like that. And to just sort of, push back against that, I think that's important. But I think that in there, it allows the students sometimes to bring stuff to us, right? And where they can actually, when they're talking about something, or they want to show something, especially in their groups, that they want to show something or brings two different things into dialogue, that they actually can do that from their site in the room and then share that with the rest. And so actually the instructor doesn't necessarily, the instructor could completely, step away from any of that stuff, but still enable the students to, when they think it's appropriate, to bring it in. Whereas you could never, well, not never do it in certain other classroom spaces, but the student would have to come up to the front, and it wouldn't really be conducive to more than one group doing that sort of thing. Yeah.
The one thing that I can think of that really almost prevents that from happening is that in some of the classrooms the acoustic is lousy, to say the least. And if a student was to speak from the row half the tiers up, you would not hear at the front. And given that the majority or a good number of the students would not speak up loud, people that were sitting somewhere in that classroom would be unable to hear. And that is quite often actually prevented when we have these movable seats. So we can swivel around, and all of a sudden we are facing the other group. And I think that kind of a dynamic changes definitely the setup entirely.
Yeah, it's great.
So I'm wondering, what would you say to a skeptic about the new classroom sort of spaces and models and flipped classrooms and scale-up models and all of these different things? And university students should be able to sit and have the attention span to listen through a lecture, that they should have note-taking skills. They shouldn't have to rely on slides being sent to them all the time. That there are some skills that are maybe not being developed in these other types of classroom models. What would you say to those skeptics?
I believe that the students will still learn that content. I believe they will learn other aspects that are just as relevant and perhaps even more pertinent, such as the ability to listen to other people, take in the information, synthesize it, and then feed it back in a different way. Whereas if it is a unidirectional instructor at the front, everyone else at the back, it is really just one-way communication. So in that regards, the ability just to change the environment, to me, it's the ability to interact. And by and large, this is what comes after university is about. It's the ability to interact and to communicate with other people.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And I think, to the skeptic, I guess I would challenge them to try a different teaching and learning environment. And I think that the experience would speak for itself. That not only in terms of taking away the skills that we just heard about, but just in terms of teaching and learning. I think the learning is And I mean, we have research to back this up as well, that it's truer, deeper learning when you're collaborating with other people, when you're being forced to grapple with information and critically analyze it with other people, defend it as you talked about. I mean, you know, it's a much more active learning process as opposed to the one-way process that we've talked about in traditional classrooms. So, you know, I think the proof is in the experience. So I would encourage them to try it and to see. So.
I think my only cautionary note is a little bit the content of what it is that you have to bring across. I do not teach anatomy, but this would be definitely a course where I can see it is a very one-directional kind of delivery of information. There is very limited discussion when we talk about where the bones and where the insertion places are. In a lab situation where we then are being confronted with, now let's play around with this kind of stuff and let's put it in a different angle, where students actually have a hands-on experience on models and so on, that is something different. But from the lecturing component, it really is from one to the other. And to be very frank, in biomechanics, in our discipline, I have to say quite often it's the same way. Whereas in the sociology of sport or psychology, well, you can actually have the forum for discussions and for openness and input on part of the students because they can relate to that.
Yeah, I totally agree that, you know, there are, not all classes will work in these types of models, and content is one of them. What about, you know, junior level classes versus senior level classes, which might be connected in a variety of ways to skill level, but also to just sheer size of the classes that you're teaching? Kimberly,
I'm teaching classes from 80 to 20, and there's no question, the smaller the numbers get, the easier and the more enjoyable it is, and the more I'm asking for this ability to move around, and also for the students to have the ability to move around. I do see sometimes, well, the acceptance when we have a large class that indeed we are kind of put in these kind of rows just out of convenience sake.
You know, I do think that definitely, you know, I mean, yeah, with the size of the room, or the size of some of the junior level classes, I mean, you know, it's harder to envision what kinds of spaces, what you could do with the space, you know, the design, and I'm sure there are a number of things. I think it's most important that that we have, you know, movable seats and things like that. But yeah, I mean, there are challenges. I mean, you're trying to, you know, I'm sensitive to what you've said about the form of material that's being delivered, and sometimes you're really trying to convey a new vocabulary, a disciplinary vocabulary, and you know, that could lend itself more to lecture if there's a sheer number of words or concepts. But at the same time, I think students are able to handle some of that outside of the room, and you know, they don't necessarily need you know, an instructor to tell them again what the book says, right? And so maybe what the instructor can do is discern what are those most challenging concepts that were introduced in the last section, right? And then sort of see, now, how can I dramatize these concepts somehow in some sort of, you know, different kind of dynamic in the room. And so you know, even in, I mean, I've been teaching this class, a different class than what we've been discussing, but a class that's capped at 80 for several years now, and actually 80, you know, for some reason it actually can work really well. Like, I mean, I'm actually amazed at what can be done, and over time I've really moved towards introducing in the room very few concepts, even though there's a number of concepts being delivered, and I sort of leave it to them to you know, deal with what the book says, and then I take these other things and try all sorts of different activities. And sometimes, you know, we have to you know, align or distribute ourselves in the room in unusual ways, But it seems to work, and I think it's getting better as I learn to present that material differently.
Right.
I think we're picking up on a really important point that, for example, the scale-up room, there's sort of I guess from what I know about the scale-up room and the pedagogy sort of behind that whole movement, is very much reliant on some of the things you were referring to, sort of this notion of the flipped classroom where, instructors will, perhaps create videos, lessons of some of that content, the lecture portion, or require students to do certain things, cover certain readings, know certain material. And I think it really comes down to what's the most valuable way to spend the time with our students? Is it about just telling them what's in the book, or is it about telling them to grapple with that material on their own and then come to class in these groups, and then let's apply that information, right, through questions that are provided by the instructor, or perhaps, here's a skeleton and you have to assemble it now based on what so it's, I think we can minimize the amount of that lecturing when we have these environments, because the students are responsible for coming to class with that content knowledge so that they can then apply that information, which is, I think, where the real power in what we can then do to support them in that application, to see if they understand it, if they don't. So to me, it's about what's the most valuable way to spend time with students, and is it in that lecturing mode, or is it in the interaction mode? And for me, I think it's in the interaction mode. But yeah.
What about so content, size of class? What about junior level classes versus senior level classes? And I might direct this question to Craig to begin with. Being familiar with high school students, do you think that coming into a first year class that they are sort of ready for that flip model, or do they need more instruction and more guidance?
That's a very difficult question. I think you would probably have students all over the map, to be honest. I think there are a number of students that would be very comfortable with that kind of model, that would be ready to take on much more responsibility for their learning in terms of that content material, and be prepared to come to class and engage with the material, and others probably not. So I think there's a shift happening. I think 10 years ago maybe there would have been very few students in that place, and I guess I'm optimistic in thinking there's a lot more now that would be experiencing that kind of learning environment. So it's hard to say. Yeah.
I know for myself, I think I'm my own worst enemy for the teaching, and sometimes in these kind of new settings, because too often I'm not patient enough. And given that I think that in many instances I try to break down, let me call it a traditional barrier, like even with the setup of the classrooms and so on, and with students actually doing the interacting among themselves and communicating, and then going on and responding to someone else and ignoring me as the instructor, I find that I do have to be patient enough to allow them to run grounds at the beginning. And this is where I encounter that myself, because of course I'm a product of history, that I'm not patient enough to allow them to actually, so to speak, fail at the beginning. That I jump in, that I try to initiate, and immediately I'm back into that expectation, one at the front, rest at the back. And because I have to say, they come, of course, with this kind of knowledge equipped from high school, or from junior high, or from elementary, that this is how it is done. And so I think and our conversation has sort of brought it again to my attention. I have to become much more patient. If I'm patient, then the students may possibly follow. And I have to allow the students to fail.
So there's a new initiative through the Teaching Center, or through Dave Hinger, anyhow, has been sort of spearheading this, and it's a classroom attribute survey where when you book your rooms, or when the registrar, you sort of set your rooms, you can pick the attributes in a room that you would like. What would your top attributes be? And would it be for junior level class or senior level class? Maybe identify that. So,
For me, it would be for any class, and I think it could be summed up with one word: flexibility. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, not anchored desks, I guess.
Right, so movable furniture.
Absolutely, yeah, and
Right.
that's what I mean by flexibility. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the movable furniture is the most important thing about any room. Movable furniture is more important than any other form of technology, I think.
I'm 100% with that one too. The only add-on to that one, I really would love to try teaching in a standing classroom.
That would be interesting.
Stand-up desks and, going to the bar, so to speak.
That's really
Around a table, a number of different fairly high or adjustable tables, and then try to see how that would work. Personally, I truly think that this would be the ideal environment.
Just a funny story just popped into my head. In one of my first teaching environments in high school, it was my birthday, and I came to school that morning, and my classroom had been stripped of all of its desks. They thought they were playing a practical joke on me, which it was. At first I panicked, and my students started strolling in and laughing, and I decided I wasn't going to give them any satisfaction, so we just had class in a completely empty classroom. And it was one of the best classes I had taught in quite some time, because they formed into their little groups. We sat in circles. There was no predetermined, structure, and it was great. So when you talk about that story immediately popped to mind, and I think there's maybe there's a lesson in that.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. And on top of the flexibility in this sort of movable furniture, space, enough sort of space for people to move, right? And to, if you're going to break them into smaller groups, that they're not, back to back with the other groups, so they can actually hear each other and they're not distracted by what's going on. So, classrooms where, students aren't just jammed in there, because that just isn't conducive to anybody's learning. The instructor can't move around, you can't get in there, you can't sort of, wake them up or challenge them if they're on the internet or whatever it is that they're doing. So that's the one extra thing that I would add to that. Now, the space and being able to move around and the flexibility, for me, really depends as well on the level of the class that I'm teaching. For my 3rd and 4th year classes, it's absolutely critical. My 2nd year class, it's nice some of the time. My 1st year class, I have 90 students, and we cover 2,000 years of history. And so I lecture. It's a lecture class, without a doubt. I do like to get in between the rows in the classroom, so that I can, bring a primary source, a document, a historical document, to a particular student and have them read it. So then I can build my lecture on that, get the students involved. And so, when I talk about that bit of space, that's important even in the lecture format. And so I think that the next question to ask would be about the new initiative, which is the classroom attributes survey, so that you are getting hooked up, or you're able to sort of check off the attributes that you would like for your particular classes. And the goal of that is that they would like to offer instructors the type of space that they need for the type of teaching that they actually want to do. And so I'm curious about how that might look in your particular discussion. So if you get your attribute survey, what might you be interested in, and would that change with your bigger classes and your junior level classes?
Immediately for me, there's an interesting contrast from where I come from at the high school level, where I have a classroom. It's my classroom all year long, and I get to turn it into whatever type of teaching and learning space I have. And it has been interesting coming to the university, where I look on the schedule just like students do, and this is my assigned space. So for me, I guess the most important element, again, is that flexibility to hopefully have an environment that I can tailor to the kind of teaching and learning environment I want to create. And sometimes lecture is needed, and sometimes group work is needed, and those kind of things. But hopefully the environment that I get to teach in will give me the flexibility to craft the environment that will meet whatever kind of teaching style that I want to incorporate that day. So flexibility for me is really key.
Yeah, flexibility for me is really the main thing as well, and I do like to be able to move into from one mode to another, and sometimes different days in the week I'm doing different things in the room. So and yeah, that does involve lecture often. So I think that the flexible movable furniture and flexibility in the room and space really allows you to use more than one mode, or if if you have a preferred mode, it doesn't mean you're stuck with whatever you think the space reflects. It can reflect almost anything perhaps, and so that flexibility is really
Yeah, I think the key about the flexibility is that you can choose whatever mode of instruction style you want with that. So,
and you can be spontaneous, and I
Yes.
think that's really important.
I think there is a preferred style, but then we can also look at it from a default style. What is it that you cannot handle? Or what is it that really goes counter to perhaps who you are or how you have to go about things? And again, it is very much focused on me, on who I am. Some of the, let me call them, disadvantages that I have. I really have a tough time sometimes in some classrooms hearing my students. And I do happen, even in large classes, I ask questions because I try to learn actually the names of students and address them by name rather than you there with the Boston Red Sox cap. So I do ask them actually personalized questions regarding the topics. And if I can hear them, well, the only way and how I can deal with them is for me to walk up, approach them. And as you said absolutely correctly, if I can go through or behind the desks, if I can go through the lanes, well, then I'm really confined. And in this regard, there must be just enough space that people can move. And so that is one of the default kind of things. I think almost the most crucial one for me, I think, is the acoustic has to be right. Now that I think about it, that probably has to be, that is the most important one. The students hearing me, and I'm hearing the students. Everything else is secondary.
yeah, and that the students, when they're in, if you want to break them into the groups, that they're not
Absolutely.
talking over top of each other,
Yeah.
or the sound isn't going over top of
Yeah.
each other, so they're distracted and unable to.
Because even in the scale-up classrooms, let's say you have 45 students in that library, 1050, and you break them into groups, you got to think very hard, okay, now how can I arrange it such that they can hear each other, but they don't interfere too much with the group that is right next to them. That is one of the constraints. But at the same time, I still rather, personally, I think I prefer having them in my classroom than venturing off and not returning. The breakout rooms are not always the best.
Yeah, the breakout rooms are interesting. I've never taught in a breakout room situation. Have any of you had that experience? So, I don't know. They send out, your students to go have their conversations, and will they come back? Or how long do they stay? Because different groups, finish at different rates, and you have to circulate amongst them to have those conversations. So it is an interesting model that I haven't had any experience with myself. But
I have one more in terms of the configuration of the, and this is why I think the standing to me is the ideal one, because the adjustment of the student to see what it is they want or have to see is much easier than when they are basically the student now being bolted down. Because there's always, why does this 6'4" sit in front of me? And then you try to look around this individual. And I have taught in actually a Turcotte Hall entry-level kind of classrooms, and the tiering is relatively low. And inevitably, the students are trying to go and look over top, but the ceiling is not high enough for the projector really catching the top part of the slides. So I think the flexibility there too, it becomes a really crucial issue for the student as well as for the teacher.
all right, well, I would like to thank you all for this conversation and for coming today. That was a lot of fun and a lot of interesting points of view. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Most welcome.